There is a set of things that virtually every human being on Earth finds revolting. The smell of rotting meat, the sight of maggots in a wound, the taste of something that has turned, the texture of something that was once alive and is now decomposing, physical contact with feces, vomit, or blood. The idea of eating food that has touched a dead cockroach, even if the cockroach was sterilized and the food was otherwise safe. These things produce a specific and recognizable response, a distinctive facial expression involving the wrinkled nose, raised upper lip, and partially closed eyes that is recognizable across cultures. A feeling of nausea or the impulse to retch, an overwhelming motivation to withdraw from the offending stimulus and to remove any contact with it, and often a persisting sense of contamination that lingers even after the source of disgust has been removed. This response is disgust, and disgust is one of the most ancient, most universal, and most consequential emotional systems in the human mind. It is also, as research over the past 3 decades has revealed, one of the strangest. Because disgust does not stay where evolution originally put it, it does not confine itself to the domain of pathogens and contaminants and things that could make you physically sick. It spreads, bleeds, and expands into domains that have nothing to do with food or disease or physical contamination. It becomes the emotional substrate of moral judgment, of political opinion, of religious sensibility, and of the visceral certainty with which human beings condemn people and behaviors they have never personally encountered. Understanding how and why disgust escaped its original biological domain and colonized human moral life is one of the most important projects in the contemporary science of emotion, and the findings are among the most unsettling in all of behavioral science. Let's begin with what disgust originally was. The psychologist Paul Rosen at the University of Pennsylvania has spent more than 4 decades studying disgust and is the leading authority on its origins, structure, and moral implications. Rosen's central insight, developed most fully in a landmark 1987 paper written with April Fallon, is that disgust evolved as an emotion specifically adapted to the challenges of omnivory. The omnivore faces a problem that obligate carnivores and obligate herbivores do not. It must choose from an enormous range of potential food items, which items are safe to ingest and which are likely to be contaminated, toxic, or pathogenic. The disgust system is the solution to this problem. It is a behavioral immune system that motivates avoidance of potential contaminants before they can enter the body. In its original biological function, disgust is triggered by cues that reliably predicted pathogen or toxin exposure in ancestral environments. Decay. Because decaying organic matter is rich in pathogens, bodily fluids and products, because blood, feces, vomit, pus, and mucus are vectors for pathogen transmission. Animals that are closely associated with decay or contamination, particularly insects, worms, and rodents. And food that has gone off, that has changed in texture, color, or smell in ways that indicate microbial activity. The disgust system also has what Rosen called the law of contagion. Once something disgusting has made contact with something otherwise acceptable, the formerly acceptable thing takes on disgusting properties. The sterilized cockroach dropped briefly into an otherwise acceptable glass of juice renders the juice disgusting to most people, even though by any objective measure, no harmful transfer has occurred. The disgust system operates on a logic of contamination that is categorical rather than quantitative. Any contact with the disgusting is sufficient to contaminate, regardless of the actual transfer of pathogens. This logic is, Rosen argues, adaptive in the context of actual pathogen avoidance. In a world where pathogen transfer is possible but invisible, and where the consequences of ingesting a pathogen can be severe, a system that operates on the principle of any contact contaminates is a sensible heuristic even if it occasionally produces false positives. The cost of avoiding a glass of juice touched by a cockroach is low. The cost of ingesting a genuine pathogen can be very high. The system errs appropriately on the side of caution. What the system was not originally adapted to do, however, is evaluate other people's behavior, regulate social norms, or pass moral judgment on individuals and groups. And yet this is precisely what it has been enlisted to do in the course of human cultural evolution. The moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt at New York University, whose work has done more than perhaps anyone's to place disgust at the center of the science of morality, proposed in an influential 2001 paper what he called the social intuitionist model of moral judgment. Haidt's central argument is that moral judgments are not, in most cases, the products of deliberate reasoning. They are, rather, rapid intuitive responses that occur before and largely independently of conscious deliberation. We do not reason our way to moral conclusions and then feel the appropriate emotion. We feel the emotion first and then construct a post hoc rationalization that justifies the conclusion we have already reached. Haidt demonstrated this with what has become one of the most discussed experiments in the history of moral psychology, a scenario he called the dumbfounding experiment. Participants were presented with a story about a brother and sister who decide to have consensual sex once while on vacation. They use two forms of contraception to prevent pregnancy. They agree afterward that it was a positive experience and that they will never do it again. No one ever finds out. The scenario is constructed so that every obvious objection to the act is anticipated and removed. No pregnancy, no trauma, no damaged relationship, no social consequences. Haidt then asked participants whether what the brother and sister did was wrong. Almost universally, participants said yes, it was wrong. But when asked to explain why it was wrong, they consistently found themselves unable to provide a satisfying justification. Their objections were systematically removed by the scenario design. They typically described the feeling of reaching for an objection, finding it already answered by the scenario, and then casting around for another objection, which was also already answered. Eventually, many participants simply said, "I know it's wrong, I just can't explain why." Haidt called this moral dumbfounding, and he interpreted it as evidence that the moral judgment came first, driven by an intuitive emotional response, and that the reasoning was a subsequent attempt to justify a conclusion that had already been reached. The specific emotion driving the moral dumbfounding in the incest scenario, Haidt argued, was disgust. This interpretation was made more explicit in a series of studies by Haidt and his colleagues, in which disgust was experimentally induced before participants made moral judgments about a range of behaviors. In one condition, participants were seated in a room that had been surreptitiously made to smell foul, producing a mild background state of disgust. In a control condition, participants were seated in a room with normal smells. Those in the foul-smelling room consistently made harsher moral judgments about a range of behaviors that had nothing to do with contamination or the source of the foul smell. In a further series of studies, the psychologist Simone Schnall at Cambridge University found that participants who had been induced to feel disgust by watching a disgusting film clip or by recalling a disgusting experience subsequently made harsher moral judgments about a range of norm violations, and that participants who had been induced to feel physically clean by washing their hands before making moral judgments made more lenient moral judgments than those who had not. The hand-washing effect, which became known as the Macbeth effect after Lady Macbeth's compulsive hand-washing after the murder of Duncan, suggested that the relationship between physical disgust and moral judgment was not simply correlational. Physical cleanliness appeared to produce something like moral leniency, as if the cleanliness of the body extended to a cleanliness of moral evaluation. The contamination logic of the disgust system appeared to be operating in the moral domain. Physical dirt produced moral harshness. Physical cleanliness produced moral leniency. These findings generated enormous excitement and significant controversy. The contamination hypothesis of moral judgment suggested that a large portion of human moral evaluation was not the product of rational deliberation, but of an ancient pathogen avoidance system that had been co-opted to perform moral functions it was never designed for. The implications for the legitimacy of moral intuitions were profound and disturbing. If much of what people feel to be morally wrong is simply disgust in disguise, then many strongly held moral convictions may be less rationally grounded than they appear. The psychologist David Pizarro at Cornell University has been among the most important critics of the disgust-morality connection from within the field, arguing that the strength of the effect has been overstated by some researchers, and that more careful experimental controls reveal a more limited role for disgust in moral judgment than the early studies suggested. A replication crisis affecting several of the most prominent disgust and morality studies has added empirical uncertainty to Pizarro's conceptual concerns. But even granting the need for caution about effect sizes and replication, the core finding that disgust and moral judgment are connected, that disgust sensitivity predicts moral harshness across domains, and that inducing disgust or cleanliness affects moral evaluation, has proven robust enough to anchor a significant and productive research program. The evolutionary psychologist Mark Schaller at the University of British Columbia has extended the analysis of disgust beyond individual moral judgment to the level of group psychology and intergroup relations. Schaller's behavioral immune system hypothesis proposes that the disgust system does not only respond to physical contaminants, but that it also responds to social cues that ancestrally predicted increased pathogen risk. Strangers, whose disease profiles may be unfamiliar, people displaying signs of illness or physical abnormality, members of outgroups whose behavioral practices are unfamiliar and whose hygienic standards are unknown. Schaller's research has found that people who score high on measures of disgust sensitivity show elevated levels of what he calls pathogen avoidance, including avoidance of social contact with strangers and outgroup members. And that, in contexts where concerns about disease are salient, people show increased social conservatism, increased ethnocentrism, and increased preference for familiar social arrangements. The implications of Schaller's work are deeply uncomfortable. If disgust responses to unfamiliar social groups and practices are partly rooted in an ancient pathogen avoidance system, then at least some portion of intergroup prejudice and xenophobia may be the social expression of a biological system that is responding to cues that ancestrally predicted disease risk. This does not make prejudice justified. The fact that a response has a biological origin does not make it adaptive in the modern world, and the disgust system makes systematic errors in its targeting of social groups, categorizing people as disgusting based on superficial cues of outgroup membership rather than actual pathogen risk. But it does suggest that certain forms of social prejudice are not simply the product of deliberate malice or ideology. They are partly the product of a biological system doing what it evolved to do in a social context it was not designed for. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum at the University of Chicago has made one of the most important arguments about the political implications of disgust in her 2004 book, Hiding from Humanity: Disgust, Shame, and the Law. Nussbaum argues that disgust has historically been used to justify legal and social discrimination against groups that elicit disgust responses, including gay men and women, people with disabilities, people of certain ethnic groups, and the poor. She argues that disgust is an unreliable basis for moral and legal judgment precisely because it is a projective emotion, one that attributes contaminating properties to social groups based on psychological associations rather than actual harmful conduct. Nussbaum's argument connects to a broader point about the relationship between emotion and reason in moral life. The fact that disgust generates strong moral intuitions does not mean that those intuitions are morally reliable. The history of moral progress, Nussbaum argues, has been substantially a history of overriding disgust responses that were directing moral condemnation toward the wrong targets. What the science of disgust ultimately reveals is something important and unsettling about the architecture of human moral psychology. Moral judgment is not, in most cases, the product of impartial reasoning from first principles. It is the product of emotional systems that evolved for purposes quite different from the evaluation of human conduct, systems that are deeply biased by the physical and social environment in which the judgment is made, and systems that can be manipulated by factors as irrelevant as the smell of the room in which the judgment occurs. This does not mean that moral reasoning is impossible or that all moral judgments are equally unfounded. It means that the emotional intuitions that feel most certain, the ones that produce the experience of immediate and obvious moral clarity, are precisely the ones most likely to be driven by ancient systems operating with ancient heuristics in a world those systems were not designed for. The things that disgust you most reliably are not necessarily the things that cause the most harm. And the moral certainty that disgust produces is not evidence of moral truth. It is evidence of a very old system doing the best it can in a world it was never built for. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.